The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar entitled Save the Day, Keys for Water Damage Emergencies. My name is Billy Zadig, Manager of Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA webpage under the Continuous Learning tab later today. Professional continuing education certificates are being offered for today's program. Those who indicated they wanted a certificate at registration and meet the requirements will receive certificates later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by one of our presenters. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Stephanie Skordas, who will introduce our speakers. Stephanie, take it away.
Thank you, Billy. It's so nice of you to have us here today. I thought I'd start by just taking a quick overview of our agenda and learning objectives before I begin the introductions. So we want to understand the importance of responding quickly and effectively when water damage occurs. We want to be able to identify gaps in emergency response plans and understand potential consequences about resilience and recovery. We want to talk about ways to learn response strategies and the best practices to address and mitigate those gaps effectively, and then gain actionable tools to build effectiveness and empower teams to navigate time-critical water damage situations. And I have the pleasure of being joined by my two colleagues, Michael Hawes and Joe Kinman, who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves. Mike, starting with you.
Thank you, Stephanie. My name is Michael Haas. I'm a member of the Ready to Respond team with Legend Brands. Before joining Legend Brands, I was a facility manager myself, working over a decade in the industry. I had the opportunity to manage everything from custodial and landscaping to maintenance, construction, safety and health, and most of the things in between. Also was glad to be able to work in several different sectors within the industry, from retail to higher education and some work with the federal government.
Thank you, Mike. Joe, same question to you. Brief intro and tell us a little bit about your background in facilities management and emergency response procedures.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, I'm Joe Kinmonth. I'm an MRO account manager with Legend Brands. I started out with the company a little over a year and a half ago. Since then, I've been working with facilities to mitigate their water loss problems efficiently, effectively, and most importantly, safely. I've managed a large part of the Northeast during this time. It's been the distinct pleasure of my life, really, to help facilities when dealing with these issues on a regular basis. Recently, I've attended multiple APA events, the Maryland and DC one, as well as MAPA in Chicago last year. I've made some great relationships in the process. I look forward to MAPA in St. Louis this year. I think it's MAPA in Kappa, so it's going to be a big one. But I'm a lifelong sales and customer service professional. I've got experience from various industries. I started out at a very young age in the chemical cleaning industry, and now I specialize really in providing solutions for facilities when dealing with water damage as well as air quality issues.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much. Absolutely. So, Joe, I'm going to ask you the first question. What are the benefits to facility managers and to organizations for bringing emergency water event response capabilities in-house?
Well, the short answer is time, money, and safety. Those first few hours really determine the amount of damage. The quicker that you're able to start, the more money you can save, and the faster that space can be reoccupied. We preach being able to respond within those first 100 minutes. It's why we put it on the title page of our PowerPoint. Having a quick response team significantly cuts down the overall cost when dealing with water damage. These events are inevitable. Every university has experienced them to different degrees. Beyond that, contractor delays can be an issue. They can cause tens of thousands of dollars in additional damage. On top of that, we've seen rising insurance deductibles, as well as the contractor costs overall. In some cases, the contractor can take hours to arrive. That's tens of thousands of dollars more than being able to respond instantaneously and potentially saving that money. Recently, I've encountered facilities where year after year or month after month, they're continuously experiencing water loss to the point where their insurance company has raised their deductible so much that they're paying a significant percentage out of pocket, or being dropped altogether. Beyond that, having your staff trained results in a much stricter adherence to protocols and overall quality of labor. You're not racking up a huge bill daily for the contractors to leave equipment on site. It gives you better options. You can ask yourself questions like, can we handle this ourselves, or at least part of the job, and then pass it off? Again, it's easier, faster, and safer to be trained and have the knowledge yourself to be able to initiate these responses. Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, Joe, great answers. And I think your emphasis on the quick response is just so important. As long as it's a safe situation for a staff to handle, anything that they can do while waiting for a contractor to come and help, if it's a larger water loss, can help them reduce costs with the contractor as well as promoting their own safety. So, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you now and ask you a question. What are some common scenarios facility managers should be prepared for?
Certainly. I think first we've got to realize that each of our situations are a little bit different. Region to region, building to building, industry to industry, there are different vulnerabilities and risks when it comes to water to be aware of. I encourage facility managers to look at three main categories. The first being natural events. Some of our friends on the East Coast might be experiencing one of those now. If you are in an area that's prone to heavy raining, heavy snowfall, if you see tropical storms or ground flooding frequently, being able to identify those problems, understand that it is a problem, and preparing for that is going to be your first step there. The next thing we look at is infrastructure. Do you already know that you have leaky doors, windows? Do you have problems with your roof, with your drains? Do you have a history of your HVAC system condensate lines freezing up and overflowing? Where are the spots in your organization where you know you need to have a little bit more attention but haven't had the time to? And what are the risks involved with that, with the potential water loss? And then finally, taking a look at human error. This could be as simple as filling up a mop bucket, getting a phone call, and walking away, only to come back and find 2 floors flooded with water overflowing from that little bucket. It could be well-meaning students getting hyped ready for game day with a football that knocks off a sprinkler head in the dormitory hallway. No matter what we expect, no matter what we plan for, people always tend to surprise us. And so it's so important to try to envision where that's going, take a look at your historical record, and be ready for the surprises that tomorrow's going to bring.
Awesome. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. What are the first steps facilities should take to develop and hone a response plan?
Absolutely. I think that in order to manage, to run any kind of program, we've got to have some perspective and take a look at where we are today. The first step that I recommend to everyone is to take a look at what you have, what your equipment tells you, what your training tells you, what your staff tells you, what your current water problems tell you. We might all have a goal of where we want to get to one day, but we've got to start with a realistic glance of where we are today. If you can look at your program, at your team, and realize that you can safely handle a water loss of up to 20 gallons, it's not a lot, but it's a starting point. That gives you the knowledge of knowing, once I exceed this amount, I need help. And the sooner we make that call, the better. To get there, you need to make sure that you know where your team stands. Who is going to get the phone call? Who are they going to call? What tools are at their disposal? Do you have a great new tool, a great new system in place to take care of the problem, but is your first responder going to have access to the tool? The first steps have to be understanding where you are now, and then going on the next step is figuring out where you want to be.
Absolutely. So, Mike, because you have been a facility manager, I have another follow-up question for you. Can you talk to us about some of the challenges, the common challenges or obstacles that you see facilities face in building a response program, and talk to us a little bit about how they can overcome them?
The first common obstacle that I've seen and that I've experienced is understanding of the system. We all have that Ron or that Susie who is going to get called for everything, whether it's water, whether it's fire, whether it's bugs, or something in the middle. Knowing who people are going to call first and making sure that they understand what needs to happen is going to help you get ahead of the game. From there, making sure that your customers, those most likely to find these problems, know who the correct person is to call. Ron is wonderful, but maybe for water, you want that call coming directly to you so that you can make those decisions, you can make those calls and organize the response. But the customers can't do that unless they know that that's the plan. So making sure your staff know what to do, making sure your customers know who to call are the first things you've got to get in place. Otherwise, the perfect plan, the perfect tools you have are not going to be ready to be deployed.
Yeah, that is just so common. You know what you want to do. Maybe it's institutional knowledge. Would you recommend that facilities have a written plan in addition to that kind of on-the-job institutional knowledge? How do you pass it on among your staff?
I think that we all see in our sector higher turnover than we'd like to see. We're constantly training new people. People are constantly stepping into new roles via promotion, via stretching their wings. And so having any sort of detailed information already written down to help with that training and that onboarding should be a given already. Throwing in those plans, adding the water response, the water mitigation is a crucial step that our teams need to know about, because when the water is flowing through the wall or through the ceiling, it might be too late to ask the question. We need to make sure they already know what to do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. All right, Joe, didn't mean to leave you alone for so long. I'm coming over to you now with a question. What resources and equipment should facility managers consider having on site to support response efforts?
Well, beyond that written plan, an understanding of the evaporative drying process is going to require a decent amount of equipment. In my mind, flood extractors, dehumidifiers, air movers, air scrubbers, and moisture detection equipment is going to be the most important pieces that you will need. Those standard operating procedures, like Mike was just saying, need to be clearly defined and known by everybody. Again, I'll use Mike and Susie, or relying on one individual to have that institutional knowledge always be available. It's really dangerous to operate that way. As far as resources are concerned, you're going to hear me use the word training a lot. Training your staff. Does everybody know where the water shutoff valves are? Are they labeled? Does everyone know what to do? Do they know the 3 different types of water? Do they understand the safety behind dealing with category 2 and category 3 versus fresh water? Do they understand what's safe and what's not? Does your staff know how to measure the area that's wet or compromised? Do they know the steps to take the response appropriately? And do they know how to stage the equipment effectively? This is something that training is going to streamline. And more importantly, do they know how to report it up the chain? So really just training, and more training. The best resources we will discuss here in a little bit, but the appropriate equipment and the proper training are always going to be your most important resources.
Absolutely, Joe. I think that what you're talking about in terms of the proper equipment is really crucial. I think, many times when we're facing a water emergency, we're, grabbing what we can. You mentioned extractors off the top. What in your mind, what is an extractor per se?
It's a specifically designed piece of equipment for water extraction. It's not a carpet cleaner. It's not a ride-on piece of equipment. We at Legend Brands developed one called our HVE 3000. It is essentially a sump pump in a 12-gallon bin that can pump up out to 50 gallons per minute through a 1.5-inch lay flat or a 3/4-inch ducting. It can pump out 12 gallons a minute. So it's specifically designed to extract water from carpet, from hardwood, or from the floor in general. Yeah, that's what our definition of an extractor is. A lot of people use shop vacs, and it's just not the same by any means.
Gotcha. Completely understand. Well, I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question about what references or other resources are available that facility managers can access for help in assessing and developing in-house capabilities.
Oh, there are so many. First and foremost, I always like to learn from the past. So that internal work order system that tracks your water damage events can be a wonderful learning tool. for reviewing past events. I mean, you can adapt and potentially improve upon how you guys respond when you do have water loss. APA itself provides incredible resources through their website as well as the app. We at Legend Brands offer our Ready to Respond program, which comes with significant resources for you and your facilities to be able to respond. Beyond that, the Center for Disease Control has an excellent website. The Environmental Protection Agency, same thing, tons of resources there. The IICRC website, the Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification website, as well as the Restoration Sciences Academy for additional training opportunities. And this is just a short list. There are many, many more than that.
Absolutely. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you, with your past background as a facility manager, are there any other resources you can add to the list for folks to think about?
Joe's list was fairly comprehensive, so kudos to him on that. The other area that I would consider is reaching out to those that you know and that you trust within your own network. Though your facility might have some unique approaches to the way water comes in, we've all dealt with it. Whether this is your mentors, your colleagues, some of us have distributors from manufacturers that we trust who might be able to point us in the right direction. At the end of the day, water is, as weird as it is to say, a common enemy to all of us. And so pooling our knowledge and working together is going to improve all of our standing in this regard.
Absolutely. All right, so one of the things that I would also like to ask you both is, what is the most critical message or takeaway you would like facility managers to remember when it comes to bringing emergency responses in-house? Mike, I'm going to start with you.
Certainly. As Joe had mentioned before, as facility managers, one of the goals of bringing different services, certain tasks, programs in-house is the cost savings. Those things that we can handle in our 40-hour week, or 40-hour week, the things that our staff can handle with the things that they have at hand are going to improve the speed that we respond and the ultimate cost in the long run if we can actually take care of it on our own. My most critical message, my most critical takeaway that I want everyone to consider is that whether you're starting today at a point of being able to handle 20 gallons of water or 3 classrooms of water or an entire dormitory floor, there's going to come a point in the process to where we can't handle it on our own anymore. We can't do it by ourselves. The earlier that we can identify when we need that help, the better off we're going to be. Keeping it in-house saves the money if we can handle it. The longer we wait to call in help, if it goes beyond our means, beyond our capabilities, the more we're going to have to pay financially, in time down, in risk to our employees, our customers, our buildings, our equipment. And so as we start on this process, it's a good idea to keep that perspective. Where are we at today? What is that point where we can't cross? Where's that line in the sand where we're going to have to get help? And make sure that you know and your team knows how far we can take it in-house.
Awesome. Joe, same question for you. What's the most critical message or takeaway that you would like facility managers to remember about bringing these responses in-house?
First and foremost, I believe safety is the most important thing to remember when dealing with water loss. In addition to that, knowledge through training provides a continuous growth opportunity, allowing your team to respond to what you as an organization want to be able to handle. And to elaborate a little bit on what Michael was saying, starting with a small foundation with fresh water and working your way up over time, you got to save a ton of money, a lot of time, and increase the overall level of safety. Utilizing that knowledge paired with the appropriate equipment for the job yields the best results every time. Again, no matter how knowledgeable you are, like Mike was saying, there is going to be an event where you'll either have to start the process or it will be too big for you. Having those standard operating procedures to deal with that and to know exactly what to do, when to pass it along to your contractor or immediately pass it along to your contractor is essential as well. And I'd like to finish by saying, starting this journey is a lot easier than a lot of people think it is. Becoming proficient and effective in dealing with water loss on campus or at your facility is fairly easy. It just takes you to make the first step. So thank you, Stephanie. And I think those are the most important takeaways.
Wonderful. Mike, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. In your current role, with your background in facility management and the assessments that you are doing on university and college campuses, how do you talk with facility managers about understanding the scope of what they may be able to handle in-house if they're thinking about bringing this kind of a program to their campus?
Certainly. One of the things that we try to look at as we're determining where you're at today and where you need to go is setting forth that first goal, that place where we can realistically be in 30 days, 60 days. This might be setting the goal realistically, knowing that you have one person on call and that at any time one person can be there within an hour. We need to take into consideration what that one person can do. It could be a 150 square foot dormitory room. It could be a 300-foot classroom. But understanding where that needs to start and then making sure that we have the training, the tools in place, and the process to be able to respond there. Oftentimes, once an organization is able to handle that first small loss in-house, it has an energizing effect. The staff who were involved feel empowered. The manager gets to count one more win in an emergency or a problem that they were able to divert. And it's a strong building block to grow and keep moving forward.
Absolutely. Joe and Mike, as we have been talking, one of the things, it occurs to me that we have been talking about, fresh water, clean water. Have we talked much about the categories of water? Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you. Will you just remind us about the categories of water?
Yeah, absolutely. Type 1, 2, and 3, type 1 being fresh water, type 3 being sewage, essentially. Type 2 we call gray water. It can be a little tricky to actually determine. My favorite thing to tell people is if you're not willing to drink it, it's gray water and it's not something that you should be dealing with. Fresh water is obviously you are able to drink it, whereas septic, you're not touching it with a 10-foot pole if you can help it. But those are the three types of water. This is strictly for freshwater response. Type 2 and 3, unless you get the appropriate training. I would say start with fresh, and then there are trainings out there where you could expand to types 2 and 3 if that is a route that you wanted to go. But if you are dealing with 2 and 3, that is an immediate call to your contractor in my mind.
Absolutely, and understandable to kind of know those limits. So when you're dealing with clean water, that is, from a pipe perhaps, or a sprinkler overhead or things like that, where I agree with you that category 2 can get a little tricky because it could be something from a clean water pipe, maybe one floor up. And that's still kind of clean. Like if you drank it, it wouldn't make you sick, but it's probably not something you really want to drink. So understanding the scope of what you want to be able to handle in-house is, I think, super important. I think that we have kind of covered all the bases of the learning objectives that we were setting out to do. Want to invite Billy back into the conversation to see if there are any questions from the webinar audience.
We do have a very interesting first question. For a water damage emergency, how do your staff triage potential electric shock hazards lurking in the standing water?
Mike, I'm going to ask you to take that question. I know that you are very keen on safety.
Certainly. So going hand in hand with the discussion earlier about what scope we want to be able to handle early on, in addition to making sure that the water is safe for us to work with, electrical is one of the other concerns that we want our first responders taking into consideration as they enter a space. Our little rules of thumb for the people that we work with is to seek out opportunities that are clean water and safe spaces. Before we enter a space, before we start working on the water, touching the water, we want to be aware of the concerns that could be around. If we believe there are any electrical hazards in the area, any electrical concerns, we want to wait before going in until we can have someone with the proper access who can de-energize the circuits in the area. We certainly want to get that water up as soon as possible, but I will always take property damage over the damage or risk to my staff, to my personnel. And so if you do believe that there's an electrical concern, wait, stand back, call the appropriate person that can make sure that that area is safe to enter, that the space is safe to enter. Other concerns to watch for are up above. If the water came from the floor above, from a pipe above the ceiling, we need to be aware of any falling hazards that could impact us, that could impact the staff and cause damage. We want to watch for chemical contamination, clutter that we may not be able to see through the water if it isn't the cleanest of water. My message to the staff is if you are not confident that you are safe, don't enter the environment.
It's an important rule.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are some of the immediate actions you should take with type 2 and 3 while waiting on the contractor to arrive?
Mike, I'm going to turn this over to you again because I know you've got hands-on experience.
Certainly. In any water event, category 1, 2, or 3, the first thing that we seek to do is to find the source and eliminate it. The sooner that we can stop more water being added to the problem, the better off we're going to be in the long run. With category 2, category 3 specifically, there's not always a valve to turn off the overflowing sewage. There's not always an option to patch that leak immediately. And so we need to get there and assess the situation. I've worked with clients who had a problem with raw sewage backing up through the floor drains in the restrooms on the first floor. The first thing that I would have them do is to get all of their personnel to the second floor, because as that comes up, it's going to keep spreading. If there's a way that we can physically barricade it to stop the spread, we can. Otherwise, get the people away from that problem to where you feel safe and secure. For category 2 water, there is still a possibility to start the extraction process as it's spreading out of the initial area to try to confine it, to try to keep it contained for when the contractor is able to arrive.
Okay. What do we tell folks about category 3? Joe?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What do we like to tell folks about how to handle category 3, water?
Hands off, call your contractor. There's, like Mike said, there's very little you can do without the appropriate training, without the appropriate PPE. I would like to avoid any and all liability at that point with category 3 water loss. And like he said, more often than not with category 3, sometimes shutting off a valve isn't going to solve your issue.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Our next question is, how would you handle the cleanup of glycol from a broken heating line?
I think that is probably where you know you don't want to drink glycol. So Mike, what would we say?
With those systems, you're going to have to rely on your institutional knowledge in-house, your SDS sheets, knowing what are the safe precautions, what are the dangers you have to look out for. And that's something where you're probably going to have a different protocol to respond, different from the clean water that we would normally be asking you to deal with in-house.
Thanks.
Okay. Our next question is, how do you categorize water leaks associated with mold, and is it safe for internal staff to handle this type of situation?
Joe, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Leaks associated with mold, first thought is going to be, you're not going to want to drink that water. That's kind of an obvious response. I'd categorize it as type 2 instantaneously. When in doubt, it's type 2 or type 3. That being said, you can, in certain instances, you'll be able to shut off the water, call your contractor, have them put on the appropriate PPE, extract the water, and then deal with your mold problem. So again, most importantly is going to be the training to understand the differences between the types of water and overall safety. If you're skeptical about it, or if there's asbestos or mold, mildew, I'm immediately going to type 2, and that's a phone call to your contractor.
Absolutely. I do know that there is specific training to handle mold issues that is accessible to staffs, but that is something where, again, depending on your staff's ability and training, you may want to come up with some different protocols. Mike, do you have anything to add?
Just building off what you said before, each organization typically has their own policies and procedures in place when it comes to mold. There are teams who have the proper certifications, the proper PPE to be able to handle it in-house. There are some organizations who, despite credentials, despite certifications, do not allow their teams to work on mold. That's something to find out today, where your organization stands on that. Safety is going to come first, and making sure that we're not exposing ourselves, our teams, or organizations to additional liability is part of our responsibilities, facility managers.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is, in your experience, what department or departments would be looking after the issue, or would it be an all hands on deck?
I'll take that one if that's all right. We've seen janitorial, facilities, and res life are probably the big three. Depending on the size and scope of the water loss, it's all hands on deck. A lot of issues that we've seen lately are staffing related. If you have 5 people on staff in facilities and another 10 in res life, and there's 10,000 gallons worth of fresh water that needs to be pumped out, you can bet that I'm making that phone call to get the assistance. I know everyone has every single day, and I'll say 8 hours of work, but priorities, I mean, that's red level priority, and getting everybody involved and then following up and finishing their day-to-day tasks after the fact. So you can bet that I'm calling in all hands on deck, depending on the size and scope of the water loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, do you have any other thoughts to offer?
Certainly. When you're looking at developing these systems, these processes internally, identifying your first responder or your first response team is one of the first steps once you've identified where you're at today. The first responders could be anyone, and we've seen multiple levels, different organizations within universities and companies responding. Like Joe said, we've seen custodial, we've seen maintenance, we've seen the safety and risk people involved, sometimes security's there. As you're defining who your first responders are, you want to consider who is going to be present and who is going to have access. When I was at a university in the South, I had custodial coverage on campus for all but about 18 hours in the work week, including Saturdays and Sundays. So the custodians were the obvious pick to be the first responders because almost always they were already there. We had a great maintenance crew, but they were only staffed on campus 12 hours a day, Monday through Friday. And so they would be the second call after the custodians started to contain. Then our maintenance, our plumbers, our HVAC would come in to help from there. So the short answer to the question, I think, is everyone could be involved. Everyone needs to know what's going on when the all hands is called. But we need to start with our first responders who are going to be there and be able to get to the tools they need to correct the situation.
I've recently worked with a university that designated a flood response team, flood response protocols, gave everybody a speech about it. Hey, it's you guys. So these are going to be your first responders in this situation. And that has already paid dividends for them. Before we even got out and provided the training, they had a 2-story water loss. Everything that they had purchased as far as equipment paid for itself after 2.5 months. They're literally their next water loss event. They were able to handle it from start to finish themselves.
Absolutely. And I would like to add, this is not really first response, but kind of as you get in and get things underway, I think it's really important to loop in your communications protocols as well, so that you can communicate with the affected students in a residence hall, for example, or faculty and staff if it's in an academic building or an athletic building, in order to keep those lines of communication clear. Because we all know that when people don't know the story, they kind of make up their own. So I think it's really important to kind of keep those communication channels open as well.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, can you talk about the process for dealing with wet drywall?
Oh, everyone's favorite. Joe, do you want to take this one?
Sure. What I like to do is we make a moisture probe called a protometer. We designate where the water stops, tape it off, and over the course of 2 or 3 days after you staged your dehumidifiers, your air movers, your air scrubbers, you move that tape line as the water recedes. I mean, first and foremost, when you have wet drywall, the crown molding is the first thing to go. I think part of our process is to punch holes through it, stage fans at 45 degrees, make sure they're all facing the same direction to create that vortex of air. Once you have that set up and staged, the water will recede down the drywall. As we know, water defies physics. It will climb walls. It will get into ceilings from the ground below. It's impressive, actually. But what we like to do is we take that meter, we designate where it ends. You take that same meter, you go to a different room, you get a baseline, go back in, tape it off. After one day you check it, after another day you check it, and you'll notice that water line start to recede. A big part of this process is keeping drywall and other miscellaneous parts of your facility out of the landfill. So it adds a level of sustainability doing this process correctly. So beyond that, we're trying to kind of save Mother Earth a little bit as well. I hope that answers your question. Through the proper training, you can track the water receding down the drywall. That's with fresh water that you're going to be able to respond to, or you can respond to, depending on what you want, what you're able to do through the training that you've received.
Absolutely, Joe. I think that's a vital consideration. If it's a clean water event, we have all, I think, been kind of conditioned to think, oh, you've got to just, cut out all the drywall, but you can actually dry it. I think the key to that is having the training, knowing the proper procedures, having the right tools to measure the moisture and be able to monitor as it dries, setting up the proper drying vortex to keep all the air moving. But most importantly, it's that quick response, because anything that you find later, a day or two down the road, water's had enough chance to really kind of get in there and start to develop microbial growth. Mike, I don't know if you've had any experience with that in your assessments.
The two things that I typically try to cover with people as we're going around, two big foundational blocks when considering drywall. The first is that it will absorb water. We've seen it happen, and that's a concern. Like you said, some organizations go in and immediately flood cut up to the level of the water and start on replacing it with construction. One thing we want to be aware of is what water is in the space. If it is clean water, if we're sure that it is freshwater category 1, that drywall can be saved. On the alternative side, if you have any suspicion that there are any bodily fluids or other category 3 contaminants in, the first step would be getting it out before that spreads so that it can be contained. The second thing to remember is that drywall can be dried. Just because it got wet, just because it has absorbed the water and started wicking up, does not mean it's a lost cause. If you can get in there and extract the standing liquid water and then start the evaporation process quickly, it can be saved. Naturally, there are limits. We're fortunate with our organization to have a house that we flood fairly regularly with hundreds of gallons of water, thousands of gallons of water, and we are able to get those structures dry within a couple of days. But the drywall can only stand being flooded and dried 8, 10, 12 times before it has served its purpose and needs to move on to its next stage in life. And so if this is the first time you're being impacted by water and it's clean water, absolutely get in there, remove your cove base, start the drying process, and you can save it.
Absolutely. And fun fact, the flood house where Mike and I received our training, I think has been in use for about 20 years. And it gets refreshed every so often, but it's been flooded 2-3 times a month for 20 years, and it is dried out every single time. So you can rehab it.
Okay, thank you. Given experience with water leaks overhead of a library and archives, I found access to a large freezer to be important to preserve the books for a professional who can mitigate damage. Can you please discuss knowing what non-facilities resources are available?
Mike or Joe, is this something either of you have had experience with?
I'm using a freezer to preserve books or documents. Is that what they're doing here?
Yes.
Interesting. I have not had any experience dealing with this particularly. I do work with a customer right now. I won't say any names, but they preserve hundreds of years or 140 years worth of very, very important documents for the government. And they will continuously run our dehumidifiers in that room to maintain and regulate the humidity, because the water in the air was causing issues with those books deteriorating significantly faster than they should. I have never used a freezer to preserve books. I would assume that running the dehumidifiers continuously, depending on your relative humidity, would keep them preserved a lot longer than having to freeze and the molecules expand inside of pages or inside of books. But actually restoring books, that is not something that is outside the scope of what we really do. I would defer you to an expert on salvaging old documents, or just documents in general for that.
Yeah, that's where you might want to consult an archivist as well, to maybe talk a little bit more in depth with that. So we can help you keep the area dry. We can help deal with advice about water leaks in the library. But if you have experienced kind of that large scale flooding that you've talked about, where you've got a lot of books that are affected, I think your freezer solution sounds really interesting. And apparently it seems to be working for you. So I think that sounds good, but maybe consulting an archivist would be another way to find additional resources.
Certainly. Stepping aside from just the topic of the books, if you are aware of anything of high value that is in your spaces that might be susceptible to water, now is a great time to get those plans in place to talk to your experts to know what the correct response should be. Whether it is literature, whether it's artwork, whether it's technological components, audiovisual, or networking. If we know that there's something susceptible to water, we should include that in our plan so that when disaster strikes, because inevitably it's going to, we'd like to know what those steps are. And as was mentioned in the question, if you have experts in the field, if you have subject matter experts in-house, make sure that we're involving them in these processes and these plans that we're writing, so that we are taking every possible precaution with these valuable materials.
Okay, thank you. Do you have mixed trades and custodians as a response team, and how many usually make up that team?
Yes, absolutely. We find that, again, it's going to be site by site. There are certain jobs that anyone can do. There are certain jobs in this response team that are specific to tradecraft training and certification. The most common thing that we find is custodians being the first responders, but we like to incorporate the other trades as well. As you are developing your program, as you're seeing your protocols, you'll be able to identify those key decision points that inform you who needs to be involved. One of the first things, as we mentioned before, is we want to make sure that we are shutting off water, any flow of additional water into the space. If those water valves are accessible to any or all of your staff, then you can have your pick of those individuals that you trust that are going to have the availability to respond. If those are in secure places with limited access, someone from that team needs to be involved so that you can respond accordingly. Similar to the question earlier about electrical concerns, if that is something that you see in your spaces, that there are often things plugged in and left on the floor that could become an additional hazard during a water event, make sure someone with that electrical knowledge, someone with that electrical access is involved, so that you already have them trained and aware of what's going on to be able to keep yourself safe.
Okay.
I'm currently working with a university that has a lot of universities will break down by zone. So they have kind of individually trained their janitorial as their first response in each one of these zones. On top of that, they have a flood response team and kits in each one of those zones for additional aid and additional response. They're the ones that, while the water's being turned off, they're loading the trucks or the trailers, and they're bringing the equipment on site, getting those HVs and the air scrubbers set up immediately after the water's been extracted, then setting up their dehumidifiers and air movers. But I completely agree, having engineering, electrical, HVAC understand the process as well. Just kind of going back to the question earlier about the safety of the electrical outlets, making sure that there is someone who is qualified to test those outlets and make sure that you're not putting yourself in a very, very dangerous situation.
Absolutely. And part of the question was about how many usually make up a team. And I think the answer to that kind of depends on your institution. It could be as little as 2 people for a small clean water loss. Somebody, 2 people to help extract the water, set up the equipment, set up the drying, take the measurements. That's something that could easily be done by, just a couple of people. For something larger, naturally you would want to expand it. So as you are thinking about how to set up your in-house response, that kind of goes back to what Mike was talking about earlier, and Mike, I'll ask you to talk about this again, is determining what kind of scope of a problem you'd like to be able to handle.
Certainly. As we're lining out how many first responders we need to have, I think the more important question first is, when do we have people on site? If you have 3 shifts working around the clock, having a first responder on each shift will carry you through until someone calls out sick, until someone's on PTO, until someone's not available. I try to identify the different circumstances during the workday, after hours, before hours, holidays, weekends, and make sure that there are at least 2, and if possible, a 3rd person available and trained for each of those situations, so we have that backup and we have that coverage. As Stephanie had mentioned, when you're first responding, when you're starting your extraction process, that is work that can be done by one individual. If the tools are available and if the person knows how to use them, that first 100 minutes can be spent extracting the liquid water, and that's the best way you can spend that time. Having the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 12th person really comes in once the extraction is complete and you start setting up your equipment for the evaporative drying process.
Absolutely. And Mike, just to piggyback on your comment about holidays, because we know that that's when there's always some sort of a water emergency. A lot of universities will close for a week over winter break. And then one of the things that we have been advising our clients is to consider setting up a water response equipment protocol for those times, because it's going to happen Christmas Eve when we have the deep freeze that nobody was expecting and all the pipes start freezing and then bursting. So make sure you think about that over the holidays as well.
Thank you. Our next question is, would you recommend air quality sampling following any water damage event?
We sure do. And as a matter of fact, we take it a step further. Mike, talk to me about the equipment that should be involved once extraction is done and we're setting up the evaporative process.
As we're extracting, as we're going through the drying process, we're always going to want to be taking measurements and readings of these surfaces that have been affected, that have gotten wet. Carpet, hardwood, drywall, your curtains, your furniture, whatever wet, we're constantly taking those readings. Specifically to the moisture content currently in the surface that we're drying. I would caution, as you start talking about air quality readings, to make sure that your process is aligned with your internal organization. There are, at some sites, specific people that need to take those readings, who know what they're looking for. At certain sites, there's specific equipment that needs to be used. On the topic of equipment and detection and metering, you need to make sure that you're using the same piece of equipment for all of your readings, for all of your measurements. Even the finest calibrated tools are going to be slightly off in their calibration, and using 4 different models of the same piece of equipment could yield different readings and trip up some of your response patterns. So for the air quality, first make sure that your organization is okay with those readings being taken and recorded. Make sure you know who in the organization is allowed to do that and what equipment needs to be used. And if the organization gives the green light on all of those, then absolutely. Humidity needs to be tracked as we're drying out the spaces. The temperature in the space needs to be tracked. There are air quality meters that can give you other readings that might be important to your organization, but that's an internal decision.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Joe, do you have anything to add about the importance of air scrubbers as part of the evaporative process?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to just elaborate a little bit more. You can have the most perfect calibrated tool on the planet, but if you don't establish an appropriate baseline, either by going to a different room down the hall or with moisture meters in the drywall, going to a room adjacent to it where there is no water damage and establishing that baseline, you won't really know where you need to end up when you are actually doing the evaporative drying process. As far as understanding the humidity levels and the temperature of the room, if you utilize our dehumidifiers, you'll actually get that on the heads-up display, as well as GPP, which we don't need to delve into. But so you will have the majority of the information kind of at the ready. If you want to test individual air itself, you will need an additional piece of equipment. They get overly complicated, or they get pretty simplistic. But yes, I do recommend taking air quality readings. I do recommend establishing the appropriate baselines. All of this, again, back to my favorite word, training, and more training. This will be, if you do end up training through us or through somebody else, those three things are going to be drilled into your head by the time you leave.
Absolutely. And then again, you know, just once more to reiterate that your own organization may have a specific policy around air quality and who is equipped to certify that. So always take that into consideration.
Thank you. Our next question is, what category of water does storm water fall under?
Storm runoff, if it goes into a drain or a storm drain or something along those lines, more than likely it's encountered oil, mineral, gas, septic. It's if you have a light flood to massive flood, that's all type 3. That's all going to be type 3 immediately.
It's
What
storm
about
water that's falling from the sky through your roof, through your window. There's a potential for it to be category 1 or category 2, depending on what it's come into contact with. But as Joe said, as soon as that storm water has run across or through the ground, we label it as category 3 and take extra precautions because we don't know what it's met, what it's run through, or what else has been added.
Exactly. Yeah, rainwater is totally fine. Do keep in mind that rainwater will start to grow mold and mildew almost in 24 to 48 hours. So that is something that if you don't address it right away, or if you find it 3 days later, all of a sudden it's type 2.
Okay. Now, our next question is, do you get your procurement to take on any material losses, or does your FM crew manage that?
Mike?
That is going to go organization to organization how that is handled. I've worked with organizations where I have had the leeway as the facility manager to start the response, to start the repairs, and manage it within my own wheelhouse, my own frame of working. And I've worked in organizations where as soon as we have isolated the problem and started extracting the water, then there are procurement protocols in place to determine the next steps to go from there.
Okay. Thank you. How important is it to have several locations on campus where you keep your equipment in case of emergency?
Perfect example of that. It's very important as long as you can respond within the first 100 minutes. I'm working with a customer that unfortunately their only storage is on the 7th floor. You have to take an elevator up to the 5th or 6th floor and then essentially walk a quarter mile to another elevator and then take that up. And then they have to load the equipment up and get back in time, essentially. So I find it incredibly important. If you can respond, I mean, we always say 90 minutes or less, but the faster that you can get the equipment there and start extracting, the more money you're going to potentially save. If you have a 2 or 4 inch pressurized pipe pumping out anywhere from 1,000 gallons to 5,000 gallons an hour, as soon as you can get there and shut it off and start extracting, you will be better off. It's one of the things that we like to do is break universities down by the zones that they already have established and recommend placing kits at each one of those locations for easy access and quick response.
My personal rule of thumb is to make sure that I have extraction equipment, properly rated commercial extraction equipment, within 30 minutes of any point on campus to where I'm going to need to respond. If I've got a smaller compound to where 30 minutes pushing our wheeled extractor can get you to the limits, then I only need one location. If I'm dealing with a situation where you could take an hour to walk from one end to another, you're going to need to have multiple kits spread out so that you can be there and you can be working. The 100-minute timer to do the extraction is not necessarily 100 minutes to get started. The amount of work you can do in that first 100 minutes. So if I've got my equipment within 30 minutes, I can count on having 60 minutes of extraction before we hit that first milestone.
Absolutely. So I think while our preference is to kind of spread it around campus in order to make that response as quick as possible, we do have some clients who have focused on setting up kind of a mobile situation where they may have a trailer that is easily, hooked up to a truck, and you could take it wherever you need to in just a few minutes due to their storage space. So it kind of can depend on your terrain, the number of buildings you have, the amount of water loss you're prepared to handle. We have seen campuses where, there's terraces, there's different levels, or it's very hilly. So having kits kind of spread around campus in those zones can make water response very, very quick.
Okay, thank you. If you cannot dry an area in 3 days, should the wet area be removed?
That's a bit of a loaded question in a way. There are so many variables depending on what type of flooring you're working with, depending on the concrete or the subfloor. I would say the average drying process can take anywhere from, after you've extracted all of the water, can take anywhere from 3 to 5 days. And that's kind of pushing it out. It can take a little bit longer than that, in all honesty. If you're working with direct glue down carpet, I mean, we've cleaned up during our training process 5 gallons of water in 8 to 12 hours, and it's been perfectly fine. If you're dealing with additional subfloor or hardwood, I've done jobs that have taken 5, 6 days to get those numbers back to where they need to be. So it's also going to depend on the square footage or cubic feet that you're working with, the size of the room, and the equipment that you're using. Case in point, if you're using our 6,000 is good for 10,000 cubic feet, and you're working in a 6,000 cubic foot space, but it's what you got, it's overpowered for that area. You're going to need to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of air movement, but it may speed up that overall process by 24 hours, 36 hours. You're only done when those readings fall within the baseline, and that can vary. It can vary. There is a lot of X factors when dealing with water damage. And not every building is the same, not every floor is the same, not every concrete pour is the same. Some is more porous than others. So unfortunately, a loaded question, but I've seen it as quick as, small water loss as 8 hours, 10 hours with great HVAC, great dehumidification, and enough air movers to a week. So it will vary. Use the measuring tools. Use the measuring tools. The training is going to emphasize that these are probably your most important pieces of equipment, and once you reach your baseline, you're good to go.
So I will expand on that just a little bit. The 3-day mark is a common refrain and a possibility that we have heard. I would not treat it as a hard and fast rule for every case. This is one where, as you're developing your plans, you want to make sure that you understand the priorities, the risks, the concerns of the organization. If the goal is to preserve as much of the building materials as possible, it is not uncommon for a drying process to go on, as Joe said, for up to 5 days. As long as we're tracking progress and we can see that it is getting drier, it's an option to keep going. If your organization is losing money from not having access to a certain space, then having access might supersede the priorities with drying to where you may want to go rip it out and start the reconstruction. And that will differ from organization to organization, from building to building, and from the use of the space. Losing access to a storage closet for a week may not be the end of the world. If you've got student housing without reliable backup spaces, that's a different conversation. If one of your premier auditoriums or classrooms goes down, you may not have 3 days to wait to get it back up and operational. That'll be largely an internal, but as a starting point, a rule of thumb, 3 days is a safe number to start make those determinations.
Okay, well, thank you. We are out of time, and we still have some questions that have not been asked and answered. So I will get those over to the panel, and we will get those answers out to you. So Stephanie, Joe, and Michael, thank you so much for a great informative webinar today. And we look forward to doing this again. And to our attendees, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. So until next time, be safe, stay healthy, and let's be kind to one another. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.